Hi, and welcome to my ADEX 2020 talk about rec photography. My name is Simon Lorenz, and in the talk today, I want to cover everything that's relevant to take a good photo of a rec. So let's first start with introducing myself. First, a couple words about myself. I'm an underwater photographer. I've been doing that for over 10 years now. I live in Hong Kong, but I'm actually from Germany. I do pool photography as well as write many articles for magazines, and I run this company called Insider Divers. We do group trips all around the world, always trips that are led by experts such as myself to give you a superior dive experience. On all of our trips, we actually take a group photo, even when we are on a wreck like here in Palau. So if you come with us, you will be part of a good group that takes funny photos. So let's start talking about wreck photography. And at first, I want to start talking about where I took most of these photos. These are all photos in the Pacific. And you know that we had a part of the World War II, which was the Pacific War, and we've got several parts here that had huge battles and left underwater cemeteries. The ones that I used here are Truk Lagoon, one of the most famous, which is in Chuuk, Micronesia, which today has a lot of wrecks. So you have over 60 wrecks that you can dive on. Some famous ones is the Nippo Maru, one of my personal favorites, the Sanki-san Maru, or the Hoki, which is loaded with trucks, as well as one of my favorite spots here is on the Kensho Maru, which is a galley where you have a wok in there, and that really creates a nice atmosphere. The most famous one, of course, is the San Francisco Maru, so that one will also come up in this talk. The other one is Palau, and many people think of Palau as, home of blue corner or blue holes, like in this picture. But actually, there was also a big fight here, and also left quite a few wrecks underwater in very good conditions. So there are probably 20 diveable wrecks and planes around, all the way down to 100 meters. So recreationally, you have 10 to 12 that you can dive on. Some famous ones, and the best one definitely is the Iro. There's also the Tesho Maru, which is a really nice boat to dive on. There's the Helmet Wreck, that's unfortunately now closed. And then there is a famous plane called Jake's Seaplane that will also feature in this talk. And then the third big one is Bikini Atoll. That's actually not part of the Pacific War, but just right after. So the Americans tested here their nuclear bombs on a fleet of ships, including US, Japanese, and German ships. So the most famous one is actually a US flagship cruiser, an aircraft carrier, one of the few aircraft carriers that are diveable. This is the USS Saratoga. There are actually quite a lot of Hellcats lying around in the sand that you can dive on. They will feature here as well. Then we have the USS Arkansas, which is a World War I, World War II ship, very interesting. And we've got the Nagato, which was one of the two flagship ships of the Royal Japanese Navy. So let's start first talking about equipment, and you can see this gentleman here is dressed a little bit differently than you might be on a different dive. It's quite important to bring protection for your head and your hands. So make sure that your standard packing for a wreck dive, particularly when you're going to do photography, includes a hood, because you often move up and down in the wreck and you might hit your head on a rusty bit. So make sure you've got that protection there. Also gloves, absolutely not something we would normally wear on reefs, but inside a wreck you should definitely have them, particularly like this gentleman here is on a bed of live ammunition. So if you do have to touch something, it's better if you're actually wearing gloves. And then finally, you should have several torches if possible. Can be small ones or big ones, but that is essentially the dive gear that you want to be taking. So let's talk about the camera. So best is, of course, if you have a system camera, you should be using a fisheye lens. So you will see that even with a wide angle lens or even other focal lenses that you might have, you will have problem getting a lot of scope into the picture. So make sure that you have a fisheye lens, and if you're using a compact camera, that's no problem, but try to get a fisheye adapter or wide angle converter lens that allows you to just, get more into the frame. Lighting wise, you should take as much light as you can, but definitely you want to have 2 strobes and a focus light. But then any additional lights you can use for positioning around the wreck for additional lighting, so that's also good. So here you would, for example, position one of your lights on a tripod or an underwater tripod. You can also use normal gorilla arms. That will allow you to position off lighting in different places. So that's useful to clip onto a BCD, as well as remote strobes if you want to use those. So you just need to have a cable and a trigger for that, and a third strobe obviously. So those are possibilities of bringing onto a rec dive. So I'm going to go through a couple of topics today. I'm going to start with the story because I find that it's very, very good in a rec to tell a story. We're going to touch natural or ambient light as well as strobe lighting. We're going to talk a little bit about framing and then also the use of humans, so models in your photos. And finally, I'm going to have a quick note on editing in Lightroom. First of all, you want to tell a story with a picture. You want to convey a certain information. You can talk about the previous life, so you're trying to show what things are now underwater that you can now recognize still, like these tanks on the San Francisco Maru and Truck Lagoon. You know, you can recognize that this was a tank, or you can recognize the telegraph or these dials in the engine room. You can point out the size. That is a story in itself. So particularly if you use a model in clear water, then you can point out the size of the ship. Here you can also see another perspective, which allows you to really convey the message of how large a vessel like this is. You can convey the sense of exploration. It's a story, right? You can tell, create that situation where a diver is exploring a wreck, and that is the story that you're telling with your photographs. Here, this was like a very momentable moment when we were in the dentist room at 45 meters in the USS Saratoga, and we had to go back to take this photo because you enter and you can already see the dust is rising. So we went back just to capture the situation of not only the dental chair, but actually a diver with the dental chair. But that is the story here. You can talk about the story of death. Not everybody wants to do that, but if you are not rearranging the artifacts, the leftovers, then I find it can still be a very interesting thing. Like here in Truck Lagoon, there are places where you still have leftovers from the fallen. I think it is a powerful photo if you can, but I think you must respect that these are dead people, so while photographing is okay, you should not be touching. This is actually one of the last photos ever taken of the Red Skull in Truck Lagoon. This was a skull that was still left here for quite a long time. The Japanese government would come and collect leftovers of the fallen from time to time, but on this ship you could still see this, and literally a month after we were here, in 2016, this skull was removed. You can talk about the aquatic life because, you know, wrecks are today often a perfect reef, and create reefs in places where there normally aren't reefs. And if you can combine the earlier story of, you know, objects that have been in human use above water, like this huge cannon, and today are a great coral reef, I think that is also an interesting story that you can talk about. So let's talk about light, and I'm going to start with natural light, because a lot of rec photography, you're actually just using your natural light that is coming into the picture, and you are not able to use strobes because it is a too large area to cover. So in those situations, you want to make sure that you use the sunlight smartly. So you want to have the sun behind you like a giant strobe lighting up your subjects. And sometimes I just don't photograph certain things because the light is against it. You can make use of the light against it. Here you can see it on the mast of the San Francisco Maru. Then if you can create a nice silhouette, that can work as well. But like on the Eero here on the left, you can really make use of it, of taking a natural light photo without any strobes that has a very nice sphere. Of course, you can use this natural light to silhouette. Right? You can also, inside a wreck, use cracks in the ceiling, like here in the helmet wreck, to create a picture with natural light as if it were a guided light. So here you can see the engine room in the helmet wreck lit up without strobes, which I kind of like better than all my shots with the strobe, because you've got kind of this top lighting here inside the wreck. The really tricky part is the combination of the natural light or ambient light and the artificial light, because the strobe lighting is really where we get those details back. And you need to differentiate between what is actually lit with natural light and what is lit with your artificial light. In a scene like this, we're actually only lighting up the tank and the side of the ship here with the strobe. The rest is done with natural light. So the approach that you need to take here is you need to set your lighting to avoid that the light is too bright. You can see that you have here blurry natural light. That means I've somehow taken the photo without planning my shot. Right? You can see I've just taken a photo and it's clearly too bright in here, and I've just looked at my strobe light that you can see here is also not really well done, and so I've got 2 times the light really badly done. On the one hand, we've got the over blurry light from the top, and then our strobe light is also quite messy. So what you want to do is separate the 2 steps. You want to think about your strobe light in 2 steps. Okay, first set your natural light, second your strobe position, and only after that you want to think about strobe power and finally framing. So if you do it in this order, you're going to be able to take much better photos. So let's start with the first step, which is setting the right natural light. I usually just take photos of my environment either with my strobes off, or in this situation the strobes poorly powered, and I want to make sure that all my ambient light, so everything that is lit up by the sunlight or that I want to capture without my strobe light, is set up in the right way. And only after that I add the strobe light. So remind yourself to do this in 2 steps. You will create much better photographs. Right? And that is what I call test shooting, is the T model. So you want to do test, shoot, examine, adjust, and keep doing this in a repetitive way. That is how you prepare for the shot before you actually go in close to take the photograph. Right? So here is an example of doing it inside the wreck. What you very often see are the skylights, like here in the Kensho Maru. You can see that those skylights often, you don't even see the pattern of these bars at the top. That is because you went straight to strobe lighting. So first you want to take a photo that's really dark, which just has the right light for the skylight, and then you add your strobe light. Now you've combined a perfect, you have a combination of the strobe light and the skylight still being there. So make it in the 2 steps and you will find that you get much better photographs out of it. Now, how to set your natural or ambient light. I like to call it the pyramid of light rather than the Holy Trinity. So I think of it more of a step-by-step model. The most important one is though that you have your ISO in the right setting. So your ISO is the first thing that you get rid of. So you make sure that you don't have any light bleed at all before you go to the next step. You use your aperture and your shutter speed to fine-tune your lighting, and I'm not going to go in detail here, but if you're interested, I do have some tutorials on my YouTube channel if you want to look into how to use your aperture and your shutter speed. Next is your strobe light, and I would like to think of the strobe light like painting color and detail into your picture. If you think of it as just illuminating, you often don't see the benefits that you can have by different strobe positioning and gently adding strobe light where you need it. First of all, you need to make sure that your strobe position is always strobes behind your lens. That will avoid backscatter that we generally have a lot of in RECs, so make sure your strobe is always behind your camera. Secondly, we don't want to shoot as wide as we would, particularly when we're inside. We don't want to shoot as wide as we would do a normal wide angle photo, because we actually can have reflection of the light from the side of the REC. So make sure you don't keep your strobes too wide. Of course, if you're outside of the REC, you can keep them nice and wide. So here, for example, this is a wide setup, but it is not too wide, avoiding the reflection of the wall that's just right to the left of me. If you're doing close focus wide angle, which is a great opportunity inside RECs, is where you can get really close to certain parts of the machinery, then you need to set your strobes much closer. I like to call this the triangle rule. That basically means the closer your subject, the closer your strobes. And it's not, of course, a scientific thing, but essentially you want to try and get your strobe light distance from your subject roughly similar. So that means the closer your subject is to you, you want to bring in the strobes closer. That allows you to still have nice light on the center, but not create sort of shadows of your camera. So here you can see a typical picture where I'm still from an outside setting and I'm lighting up the outside of, in this case, it's a part of the wreck where we're diving through in the Tesho Maru, and you can see the outside is really bright, but where we're going is pretty dark. There you want to use a different technique that some people call bunny earring. Generally, I just want to remind you that if you put your strobes up, you can create much more reach. Like on this photo here, you can see that if I put my strobes up, you're creating a much further reach with your strobe light than if you're having your strobes at the bottom. Another thing that I like to call surface lighting is when you actually direct the strobes to directly light a subject. Normally, we try to use only fringe light, but you can create nice dramatic effects like with this gas mask on the Nippo Maru when you create top lighting or surface lighting. Surface lighting means looking at your lighting like where the light will land. So if you have, for example, a surface like this, then you want to have the light coming from here. If you want the light coming from the top, you want a light from the top. And therefore, you need to decide which way you want to light your surfaces. So here, for example, we've got one of the trucks in the Hoki Maru, and the strong light needs to be coming from the left because we want to get the detail on the surface that you can see is diagonal to the rest of the subject. Here you've got another one that we need to light only from the left. If we would light it from the right, it wouldn't look right. So here I actually turned off one of my strobes and just used one strobe to light this up. The third step is the strobe power. So in your strobe power, you decide how much light you want to get on. And I would generally start with a lower setting and then gently paint light in. So gently increase your settings, getting to the right point just before you create backscatter. And often you actually can, in your editing, then later go one step back and use your middle or medium lit picture in order to do your edits. Here we've got the same photo of the Nippo Maru again. Talking about framing is how you arrange your picture. So now you've already decided on your natural light, on your strobe position and your strobe power. Now you can actually come in. And very often it's good if you stay away from the subject, the area where you want to take the photo, to get all your other three settings right before you go in. Because as you know, the longer you hover above a reef, the bigger the chances of sand or debris or anything coming up, which then creates backscatter. So the rule of thirds, obviously, most people should be aware of a classic teaching of arranging of art. So the eye can gently and comfortably consume what is in the picture. An important aspect here in Rex is where do we position our negative space and what do we do with it. Negative space is an important aspect because negative space is what gives you a three-dimensional impression of the picture. We have our main subject here, these big shells, but in the back there is the diver, which shows us not only that this actually is a cargo ship lying on the side, but also how clear the water is, you know, how large this whole cavern or this cargo hold of this ship is. And so this is quite important that you leave space for the eye to travel. So the negative space is almost more important than looking at your rule of thirds. So now that we've talked about models, let me talk about this. I find almost every rec photo is better with a model in there, so with a diver in the picture. Right? If we take this example here, this is, I think, the telegraph on the bridge of the Fujikawa Maru, and this is a picture with of just that telegraph, and here is a picture of a diver with the telegraph. It just gives a personal touch. It lets the viewer imagine what it is like to dive here. It is also a frame of reference for how you would dive here. Right? You can use the diver as a silhouette to convey size. Here's an example of a ship in I don't know, I think Truck Lagoon, where you can see that, you know, it's quite hard to tell what size of ship there is. But if there is a diver in the picture, now you can tell much better what kind of size we're talking about. If that diver also has a strobe, we're not only creating that same sense of scale, but we create a different balance. We have another light source which can create an interesting extra element to the picture. It also helps to locate where the diver is. So here you can kind of see on these two pictures of the submarine, the Apagon in Bikini Atoll, you can actually see where the diver is thanks to those lights. You can use the light also as a diagonal. So obviously if you have a nice strong light, you can use it to show the viewer where he's supposed to look. So if your model points the torch in the right direction, it actually makes a natural guide for the eyes where to look. Right? So if you want to make use of that diagonal aspect, you want to make sure that the diver doesn't shine it across, but shines it at a 45-degree angle. But also you want to make sure, which this diver is clearly not doing here, is that the person looks and shines at the same place. So better would have been here to shine at the levers in the middle, or whatever that is, because that would make more sense. So the diver should be looking and shining in the same direction. So here are a couple of added rules, and I'm actually covering this in my other talk at ADEX 2020 that is only about how to look good underwater and how to model underwater. So if you are interested in this segment, please follow my other talk as well. So the most important thing really is that we don't have any bubbles. And I'm not telling you to hold your breath, but I am telling you that you want to make sure that there's no bubbles. So make sure you breathe in gently, long time until I take my shot, and then burst exhale so that the bubbles can travel out of the picture while breathing in again slowly. So then we create a nice photo that's clean of bubbles, right? Don't look into the camera. That never really looks good unless that's what you're going for. So in this situation, it would have been much better if the diver would have been looking ahead, going down into the wreck. Like this guy is looking right at the subject, right? But his mask is still positioned in a way that his face is visible. So even if the subject is looking directly at the subject, but not at you, it would be good if the mask is pointed towards you, allowing light to light up the face inside the mask. If you want to go in the other way, so the more extreme, sort of more, cool looking way is the exact opposite. You want the mask to be in a position that is fully black. And later in editing, you could actually blacken out whatever are the less bits that are left. But that makes it more of a tech diving look, if you will, and can be a quite nice feature. So you just want to think about the one thing you don't want is a half-lit mask, which really looks lame. The body position is really important. I cover this, like I said, in my other webinar. But here you can see a diver where you can see both legs visible. And on the left here, you can see a person who's just hanging in mid-water, totally not behind the subject where he normally should be, and not looking very graceful either, right? Whereas the person on the right is having nice, proper trim. Both of his fins are visible and the light is shining in the right 45-degree angle. So make sure that the body position of your model is in the right way. Like this is a very nice streamlined picture. And if you are side mounting, you know that particularly if you have two tanks, you want to make sure that those tanks are trimmed properly. Some people would snuff at a too sort of diagonal look of the tanks. If your buddies are photographers, make sure that you have a discussion about this before. So I very often, when I model for others, I often just leave my camera somewhere on the wreck, because you know what, the wreck is usually there's no current, etc. So you can just leave your camera a few meters away from the photo and just pose without the camera, because as you can see in these photos, we look quite robot-y with these cameras in our hands. And so it's not always a good idea to have the camera in there. And if you are in the picture, at least make sure that the strobes are nicely lit. And rather than the focus light that this guy has on in this picture, you want to have the focus light of the strobes on, so at least you get nice two lights. Now you can of course pose as well, looking in the camera opposite to what I've just told you, but that is a particular shot, particular style of photograph that you need to choose to do, and this particular one actually became the cover shot of a magazine. So generally I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't make use of looking directly at the camera, but those should be very specific shots. Most of the time the model should be looking at the subject. Last but not least, I want to touch a couple of points on Lightroom editing. Lightroom editing is very helpful, and if you can plan on it, if you know that you have this ability, then you can actually focus more on underwater photography underwater because you don't have to shoot perfect. You can see this is one of the pictures of the red skull, and as long as you shoot in RAW, which is really important, make sure that you always shoot in RAW even if you're in a compact, then you can actually bring back so many details in Lightroom that you thought you might have lost. So you can see the before and after is quite a big difference, and in this picture we actually see the red skull. Also, your white balance, you don't have to worry about that. I always say forget about your white balance underwater, not the thing that you need to fiddle with. Because you're shooting in RAW, you can bring all those colors back in Lightroom, so no need to worry about that. Make sure that you shoot in RAW, and then you can even do here, what you can see here in the belly of the Eero, there are these cool sake bottles, and I totally messed up this picture. One of my strobes wasn't firing, the other one was too low. So really, really horrible picture. But with the use of gradient masks and radial masks and the brush tool, you can actually regenerate a picture that I call a total recovery. So on the left here you can see it looks like a lost photo, but if you know how to use Lightroom, then you can bring all of those details back. So what did we talk about today? I wanted to remind you to make sure you always try to tell a story with your rec photo. Understanding natural light is one part that we talked about. The strobe light in 2 steps, right? So first your position, then your power. That was what we talked about with artificial light. Make sure you brief your model is another tip that I want to give you, is to talk about the modeling underwater, above water. Before you go in the water, you already shape your expectations, what you would like the diver to do. And finally, make sure that you know your tools in Lightroom, because that will make it easier for you to take a photo that you are planning on. So thank you for your attention. I would like to point out that lots of these webinars are actually available on Facebook and our YouTube channel. Insider Divers is my company, and we're found in Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube under this handle. If you like these kind of webinars, we actually have a subsection which we call Insider Academy. There's actually a lot of stuff there, like Lightroom editing, shark photography, manta rays. We have guest photographers like Tobias Friedrich and others. So make sure you stop by our insideracademy.com, where you can find links to upcoming webinars, but also all the recordings to previous webinars. That was it. Thank you very much for listening in, and hope to see you at ADEX 2021 in person. Have a good rest of the show. Bye.